So, over the past, say, month or so, I've been reading a lot into conservatism, reading a lot of the conservative thinkers and the different ideological points of views, and more recently, about 2 weeks ago, I stumbled upon The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. Now, The Conservative Mind, it's about 600 pages, it's big. It is like the conservative history or manifesto or whatever you want to call it. It takes all of conservatism and it's one big analysis of what does this thing actually represent. And this isn't something that 6 people will tell you this is the case and they're all nobodies on the internet like myself. This is something like Russell Kirk, the author of this book, was a very massively influential conservative in America. Like he directed conservative. He is the expert on conservatism in a lot of ways. So when people look to him, like, this guy is considered the authority on conservatism in the 20th century America. So I do want to go through a few things here, because the interesting thing is I consider myself at this point, I should say, a conservatarian. I agree with a lot of conservative principles, but I honestly just can't call myself a conservative just because of how awful the conservatives are today, in that they've completely abandoned their ideological values. And I'm someone that, like, it's in the same sense as liberal, right? Where liberal today means progressive. It doesn't really mean classical liberal in terms of like the ideology of liberalism. So it's the same thing with conservatives, honestly, that when I look at what the founding fathers believe, when I look at what American conservatives believe throughout history up until the last few decades or so, I find that I line up with them almost exactly, to be honest. So this is interesting here. I wanted to go through the 10 principles of conservatism as defined by Russell Kirk. There were originally 6, if you want to look those up, but since then he has really laid them out and divided them into 10. And this, I just want to go through them to really, like, if you want to repair, if you're a conservative and you want conservatives to win, if you want to repair your values and you really want to win as a movement, you got to return to your roots. You got to actually follow what conservatives used to believe. Now, granted, you can adapt and change, because clearly it wasn't perfect, because it got defeated. It isn't what it used to be, so there's something to reflect on in that. But again, if you want to advance conservatism, you have to look at what they actually believed when they really had values and when they founded the greatest country in the world. That's what you have to look at, and you have to compare that to the values that we have now, which are pretty much nothing by comparison. So Russell Kirk's first principle of conservatism. First, the conservative belief that there exists an enduring moral order, that order is made for man and man is made for it. Human nature is a constant and moral truths are permanent. So this is essentially like the idea of harmony, as it says right there, that there are 2 aspects of order, the inner order of the soul and the outer order of the commonwealth. This was something that Plato originally put forth, but was a bit complicated to understand. Our 20th century world has experienced the hideous consequence of the collapse of belief in a moral order. So the belief was you need a society with a shared, like, moral values. They have to have a set idea of right and wrong and justice, and they have to all, this is something super important. And as you see on the left nowadays, it's all about kind of eliminating that, the idea that there is no such thing as right or wrong or good or evil. Like, there is no such thing as virtue in this sense, where it's virtuous to be a victim, kind of. They don't really put forward this idea of doing good, that it is good to do good, and that it's good to really, like, stand up for yourself and be a decent person and help out your community. We've lost that value in that sense. And this is something that conservatives, for the most part, this is something that conservatives still advocate for, and I would argue that it's their loss of other principles that have led them to a defeat in this one. Second, the conservative adheres to custom, convention, and continuity. So this depends how conservative you want to be, because, of course, this isn't something that you don't have to be an extremist on this. There are many different varieties. You can be the, like, traditionalist conservative, with, like, the Burkean style type conservatives who really focused on the idea of tradition. That was important. That was what Burke emphasized, the idea that, hey, what's more important? Or not more important. What's more, who's smarter? 10 people that got together and read a bunch of books and thought for a while, and they're academics, and they have PhDs or whatever, and they thought about the right direction of society, or the last several tens of thousands of years of human existence, that kind of thing. That, hey, if they were bad ideas, they would have died off by now. It was clearly the most successful societies that just kind of rose up and maintained themselves over time. The idea that if we're going to manage a society, if we're going to have a society succeed, we should probably look at what has worked in the past, and we should probably when all else fails, just kind of stick to it. That's something that we should use as our default point. That, hey, where we are now is where we've been throughout the past. We know it's worked because it got us to where we are today. If we don't always have to stay this way, is what it's saying. Like, it's not saying we always have to remain exactly the way we are. We don't have to shun everything. I mean, there are conservatives out there that take this to the extreme and say, I mean, you see the Amish, for example. The Amish, for the most part, they're very slow to adopt technology. You can say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not judging that. I'm just pointing that out, that they're very slow to adopt new technology, new systems like that, and they're about taking it as slowly as they can, because they don't, like, that's what they know what works, and they continue to go that way. And I honestly, living around the Amish, kind of respect that quite a bit. But that's the idea, because the conservatives take the tragic view of man, that man is flawed and he is imperfectible, or he is imperfect, sorry. You cannot perfect a human being. He will always have flaws, and society as a whole will always have flaws. So it's better to just manage what works rather than aim for this utopian view. Like, you can have a utopian view, but your default always has to be the present. You can't take what we have now and compare it to the future or your utopian vision. You have to say, okay, this is what works. Maybe we can deviate a little bit and see how that works. If it doesn't work, let's go back. We can take baby steps here. But the idea is base everything off of where we are right now, and that's what's important. So they celebrate custom, convention, and continuity because they prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know, and that's the exact thing. There are better ways to do things out there. There are better societies and better structures and better systems that we have not discovered yet. However, it's the thing is, for every good system, there's probably 1 million bad systems out there. And for every good decision we make in a certain direction, there are loads of bad roads that we can go down. And it's better to, again, just stick with the devil you know. And if you want to try to change things, the baby steps, okay, conservatives are not for preserving things exactly the way they are. At least not most conservatives, but it's the idea that you want to maintain and enforce what we have and tread very carefully when changing. Third, conservatives believe in what may be called the principle of prescription. Conservatives sense that modern people are dwarfs on the shoulders of giants, able to see farther than their ancestors only because of the great stature of those who preceded us in time. Therefore, conservatives very often emphasize the importance of prescription, that is, of things established by immemorial usage, so that the mind of man runneth not to the contrary. These exist rights of which the chief sanction is their antiquity, including rights to property often. So this is the same thing of, again, like, this is pretty much related to the second point of what I said. If it's worked for quite the longest time, if human societies have tried different things and these are the ones that have succeeded and they've maintained these values, these are good values that we have to uphold, that kind of idea. Fourth, conservatives are guided by their principle of prudence. Burke agreed with Plato that in The Statesman, prudence is chief among virtues. Any public measure ought to be judged by its probable long-term consequences, not merely by temporary advantage or popularity. So this is the idea of just, I guess, long-term thinking, you could say, delayed gratification. And as we know, people that do delay gratification, like we can prove this, or at least that's what these studies show, that people that are better able to delay gratification are more successful in life. The idea, prudence is a very cautious approach to things. The idea of just taking that very cautious approach, and we can't rush into things. We can't just barge in and start doing stuff and see what happens. No, we have to take things very carefully. And again, it's the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. If we're going to move forward, because there is such thing as moving forward as a society, it's about taking baby steps, and it's about really, if we want to go in a certain direction, we have to look at not just the short-term consequences, but the long-term consequences. And this is something that you see very much in the more the free market economics, the pro-capitalist point of view, which is why the idea of free market capitalism and free markets, and that the idea of personal liberty like that is so similar or so related to conservatism. Because it's the idea of, we shouldn't just start passing all these rules and regulations and all. We can't just start messing with society like that. We can't just start passing laws and hope things work out for the best. We need to go very, very slowly. And not only that, we can't just, when we pass a law, we have to look at the effects of that law, not just in 5 years, 10 years, but also 20, 30, 40 years. We have to really look at, hey, what are the possible ramifications of this? We have to be very careful with what we pass. And therefore, it's always better to go at things very slowly or not at all than it is to make rapid changes. Which again is why you see, especially with American conservatism, it has this very libertarian bent to it. It's heavily influenced by libertarianism because specifically in Americans, it's about, again, knowing what works, just going very slowly. We have a system of checks and balances, a system that is meant to work slow and often result in gridlock because that's the point. You don't want all these radical changes. You want to go slow about this. As he says, as John Randolph, who, you got to read John Randolph stuff. He is a great American. Like, he is one of my favorite early American people. I find that I agree with him on loads of things. I have loads of good quotes from him. Just look up some quotes from him sometime. They're fantastic. Providence moves slowly, but the devil always hurries. Human society being complex, remedies cannot be simple if they are to be efficacious. Which, again, looking back to economics, it is interesting to see the parallels between left and right on economics, whereas the left is more like, yeah, sure, no problem. Like, we can calculate everything. We can just do some calculations, and we can calculate value and utility, and we can implement that, and all will be well. Whereas the more Chicago and Austrian school, Chicago being more like Milton Friedman, Austrian being more like Friedrich Hayek. And of course, Milton Friedman, very well-known like conservative/libertarian economist. You also have Thomas Sowell, who's related to that school, and then Friedrich Hayek, who was one of Margaret Thatcher's favorite or most influential figures for her. They take the view that, okay, things are actually way, way, way more complicated than we understand. Something like value being subjective. Okay, well, if value is subjective, which really just says that people's arbitrary value of things changes from person to person and changes over time. So, for example, it's like if I bring you a cup of coffee at 8 o'clock in the morning, you might, if you're a coffee drinker, you might say thank you. You might value that coffee. Whereas at 10 o'clock at night, if I bring you that, you're not going to be as happy because the value of the coffee has changed throughout the day. That's time preference. The idea that value is not objective, it changes throughout time. And it also changes from person to person, of course. So if you're not a coffee drinker and I bring you coffee, you're going to say, what do you want me to do with this? I don't want this. Like, I feel worse for having it. Don't give it to me. Whereas someone else is going to say, yeah, I would pay money for that. So that's the general idea that the system is so incredibly complicated that you can't just do arbitrary calculations like this. You can't just start messing with things and expect to get good results. The conservative declares that the acts only after sufficient reflection, having weighed the consequences. Sudden and slashing reforms are as perilous as sudden and slashing surgery. And you'll notice so far that as more of a like American conservative, old school conservative, more libertarian leaning, that I pretty much agree with all of these things to a certain extent. And you might find that if you're an American, you do too. You might find that if you're on the right and you live in America, you really agree with this stuff. Fifth, conservatives pay attention to the principle of variety. They feel affection for the proliferating intricacy of long-established social institutions and modes of life, as distinguished from the narrowing uniformity and deadening egalitarianism of radical systems. So this is something about human diversity. I can't remember if this was Burke or John Adams. I believe it might have been John Adams. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they talked about this idea of human diversity. And we're not talking about like the diversity we talk about today among the left. We are talking about just like what I explained earlier in the economic sphere, that people aren't all exactly the same. You can say they're equal in that they deserve equal rights, but they're not the same in that some people are more moral than others, some people are more immoral, some people are downright evil, some people are very virtuous, some people are born tall, other people are born short, some people are born male and female, some people are born talented and skilled in certain things, and other people are talented and skilled in other things. Some people are born with higher intelligence, other people are born with lower intelligence. It's that idea that humans are very diverse in how they are. Like, there's so many differences between individual human beings. And that's a great thing. That's something to be celebrated. So this idea of conforming society, much like the Marxists want, and the fascists want as well, the idea of kind of conforming society to this one nation, or not even nation, but this one global, if you're a Marxist, the idea of bringing everyone under one tent and trying to conform them together. It's not going to work. This equality of outcome is not going to work because conservatives, not only do they say that people are different, but they're saying these differences cannot be fixed. You cannot fix this. And off the top of my head, I can't exactly remember the satire that was done of making fun of utilitarianism, or I think it was utilitarianism. But the idea in general of that, hey, like, yeah, you got to take, if you have a guy with 2 eyes and a guy with 0 eyes, you got to take 1 eye from the guy with 2 eyes and give it to the guy with no eyes, because that guy will be better off. The idea that we need to equalize society, we need to equalize people people buy all sorts of things. This isn't going to happen, and we see that as a problem with the left today. That the left, they want to constantly, they want to ensure equality of outcome. They want to change and give some people certain advantages over others. They don't want to treat people fairly. They just want to try to make people as equal, enforce equality of outcome as greatly as possible. And as conservatives believe, you're not going to fix this. It's not going to happen. Sixth, conservatives are chastened by their principle of imperfectibility. So this is something more represented by Thomas Sowell's constrained view of things from his book, A Conflict of Visions. He talks about the constrained and the unconstrained view. The constrained view views humanity as imperfectible. It is flawed. It is naturally selfish. It is naturally greedy. Human beings are not perfect. They have loads of flaws, and they always will have flaws. And expecting them to be perfect is a flaw in itself. You can't do that. You see how many people just disagree on so many things and are so completely, you see people that act very stubborn, people are very selfish, that kind of thing. It's always going to happen. Now, you can provide an incentive structure, like, for example, capitalism tries to remedy these things pretty well, but overall capitalism is accounting for these things and trying to use them as constructively as possible in a way that is successful. Whereas the left tends to take the utopian view that humanity is more malleable and perfectible, and the idea is, okay, if people are greedy, well, it's the capitalist society making them greedy. If people are selfish, it's the idea of capitalism and profit that are making them that way. They think you can take these human traits and just kind of fix them by putting them in a different system. And no, that's not going to happen. They believe much more in the idea of tabula rasa, the blank slate, which if you believe in the blank slate, the idea that pretty much everyone is kind of born the same and then it's human experiences that change us, and of course the real answer is somewhere in the middle, that there are genetic differences that give us different personalities and different traits in that. But it is as well as it is also the idea that human beings, like, it's both nature and nurture. And Steven Pinker has a great book on this called The Blank Slate that pretty much demolishes this view. Seventh, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are closely linked. Separate property from private possession. And Leviathan, I believe that's a Thomas Hobbes idea. Leviathan is the state, the rampant, overarching authoritarian government, that thing. Perhaps I have not worded it exactly as they would. I know Russell Kirk refers to it specifically as Leviathan, because of course these are his 10 principles here. But that term originally came from Thomas Hobbes. Upon the foundation of private property, great civilizations are built. The more widespread is the possession of private property, and the more stable and productive is a commonwealth. Economic leveling, which is in essence the redistribution of wealth, the idea of equality of outcome, is not economic progress. Getting and spending are not the chief aims of human existence, but a sound economic basis for the person, the family, and the commonwealth is much to be desired. So it's the idea of essentially, that's something about private property and again, capitalism. This idea of freedom to, not even necessarily freedom, but the liberty to own property and do what you will with that property. For the most part, it is maintaining private property that makes society great. And that's a lot of conservatives, especially in America. And again, when I refer to conservatism, I try not to refer to the conservatives of today, like the mainstream conservatives of today, who really aren't that conservative. In this sense, I'm referring to a lot of the older, like, classical conservatism, the old right, and even the new right. Although I'm not talking about the third new right of today, I'm talking about the new right of, it's right around FDR, I believe it was the 1940s and 50s, around then. Russell Kirk was part of, I believe, the first new right. But I'm talking about them, the idea of private property and capitalism. That is a very important part of conservatism. Eighth, conservatives uphold voluntary community, quite as they oppose involuntary collectivism. Although Americans have been attached strongly to privacy and private rights, they also believe they have also been a people conspicuous for a successful spirit of community. In a genuine community, the decisions most directly affected the lives of citizens are made locally and voluntarily. So this is the idea of more, not even communes. This is not anything of communes in the sense that Marxists believe, but the idea of much more smaller, tight-knit communities. The idea of, essentially, this is actually an anti-federalist idea. The idea of, like, states' rights, that kind of thing, where it's better to shrink the unit of the community, I guess, in essence. You don't want to force people. You don't want to take the federalist perspective and force everyone. Even though people like John Adams were federalists, you don't want to force everyone into this big, overarching system like that. You don't want to put everyone. You don't want an overarching, powerful government. You usually want, like you see in Europe now, a lot of the right wing in Europe, they are much more nationalist and not a fan of the EU. They tend to be Eurosceptics because they want this more localized, voluntary community. Again, emphasis on voluntary, because you want people to be able to associate like that in groups where they really feel together, where they have a shared culture. And this is a distinct part of Southern conservatives, Southern referring to Southern America. The idea of just these small, local, like agricultural communities that they really value. They were very skeptical of government intervention. They loved their small, little, tight-knit communities, and they didn't want that to change. They wanted, they were skeptical of, honestly, industrialism as well, because that was a big change they were afraid of. They wanted these small, tight-knit communities. For a nation is no stronger than the numerous little communities of which it is composed. A central administration or a corps of select managers and civil servants, however well-intentioned and well-trained, cannot confer justice and prosperity and tranquility upon a mass of men and women deprived of their old responsibilities. That experiment has been made before, and it has been disastrous. It is the performance of our duties in community that teaches us prudence and efficiency and charity. So the idea of essentially that you should be part of your community, and that's something to be said a lot of what the welfare state has destroyed. That we look at a lot of these more like Eisenhower type conservatives, which apparently I only learned this recently, that the Eisenhower conservatives, like that's what we in America call them, apparently Eisenhower described his view as a more progressive conservatism, the idea of we need to be more leftist in terms of economics, more Keynesian on economics, we need a big welfare state. And we can see that when you have a welfare state, you actually do destroy community and the family unit and traditional values, because what happens is generally, if you could get charity, you could get welfare, you could, in a society without any kind of government welfare state, you could get aid. And what happened was you had your community. If people knew you and you were a good person and people wanted to help you, they did. And then when the welfare state came in, essentially you can be a recluse and live in your house and not ever leave out, and barely leave the outside world, and you can still survive on that to a certain extent. And you used to not be able to do that. You had to be a good, decent person that was well liked. You had to provide value to your community. Ninth, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. Politically speaking, power is the ability to do as one likes regardless of the wills of one's fellows. A state in which an individual or a small group are able to dominate the wills of their fellows without check is a despotism, whether it is called monarchical or aristocratic or democratic. When every person claims to be a power unto itself, then society falls into anarchy. Anarchy never lasts long, being intolerable for everyone, and contrary to the ineluctable fact that some persons are more strong and more clever than their neighbors, to anarchy there succeeds tyranny or oligarchy, in which power is monopolized by a few. So this is a generally more libertarian, if you don't include the ANCAPs, and some people include ANCAPs as part of libertarians and other people don't, the classical conservative, like founding fathers view. We want tons of freedom. We want, like, liberty is a moral good. We want as much liberty as we possibly can. To the extent that it keeps society together. They acknowledge their issue with anarchy is the idea that it's intolerable for everyone. They want, they acknowledge that you do need a government to a certain extent, but you don't want a powerful government. You want something, they say in the middle, but of course by today's standards it would be considered as a very tiny government. But that's exactly what they want. They want a society of like the Federalist or like anti-federal, the idea of states' rights and voluntary communities, like they said. And the idea is essentially, the idea is a small central government that is, I guess conservatives are more pessimistic in the idea that it's not going to be perfect, it's going to be flawed, men are corruptible, but you want a society where the government is small enough, essentially, that there will not be tyranny, and large enough that it is not completely absent, that property rights are still defended and protected, and there is still a community, the concept of a nation. The conservatives endeavor to so limit and balance political power that anarchy or tyranny may not rise. In every age, nevertheless, men and women are tempted to overthrow the limitations upon power for the sake of some fancied temporary advantage. It is characteristic of the radical that he thinks of power as a force for good, so long as the power falls into his hands. In the name of liberty, the French and Russian revolutionaries abolished the old restraints upon power, but power cannot be abolished. It always finds its way into someone's hands. That power which the revolutionaries had thought oppressive in the hands of the old regime became many times as tyrannical in the hands of the radical new masters of the state. Knowing human nature for a mixture of good and evil. That's the constrained view right there, that humanity is flawed. The conservative does not put his trust in mere benevolence. Constitutional restrictions, political checks and balances, adequate enforcement of the laws, the old intricate web of restraints upon will and appetite. These the conservative approves as instruments of freedom and order. A just government maintains a healthy tension between the claims of authority and claims of liberty. I read this whole thing because I think this section is pretty well laid out. It kind of makes sense in a better way that I can't describe it any better. But it's the idea that you want a small central government because as soon as you give people a political power that they can abuse, they will abuse it. As Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Or power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This idea that you don't want a strong, powerful government to control things. They even criticize monarchy, honestly, even though monarchy tends to be a right-wing idea among some conservatives. But they criticize that. But they also criticize anarchy, saying that there has to be, essentially, government has to be as small as it possibly can, but it has to exist. 10th, the thinking of conservative understands that permanence and change must be recognized and reconciled in a vigorous society. The conservative is not opposed to social improvement, although he doubts whether there is any such force as a mystical progress with a Roman P at work in the world. When a society is progressing in some respects, usually it is declining in other respects. The conservative knows that any healthy society is influenced by two forces, which Samuel Taylor Coleridge, there's a lot of good quotes by Coleridge as well. I don't agree with him that much, but he does have quite a few good quotes out there. Called its permanence and its progression. The permanence of society is formed by those enduring interests and convictions that give us stability and continuity. Without that permanence, the fountains of the great deep are broken up, slipping society into anarchy. The progression in a society is that spirit and that body of talents which urge us on to prudent reform and improvement. Without that progression, a people stagnate. So the idea, again, they're not saying that this is something that I think some conservatives even forget sometimes. The idea is that improvement is inevitable. Like, they're not opposed to it. You shouldn't be opposed to the idea of progress. It's just, as they explained earlier, take it slowly, take it at a certain pace, try to work through it as cautiously as possible. But the idea of stopping progress like that, the idea of saying, no, we need to stop progress before it happens, or we need to essentially put a limit on it. No, that's like, they tend to be pro-capitalist, and they know capitalism brings about progress, and that's fine. It's just the idea that it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Society is going to improve, and you need to make sure you kind of take that bit by bit. So, for example, social media today, it's a great technology. You're watching this video because of a video social media platform. This thing is we have so advanced that I can make this video, and people on the other side of the planet can watch this and listen to what I have to say at whenever they want, as long as they have an internet connection, and tons of people have internet connections. This is fantastic. But at the same time, you see the issues with millennials and younger people. I guess we're on Gen Z now. The idea of they're injuring their necks because they're looking at their phones too much, and that they're becoming more antisocial because they're texting people more than they're actually talking in person. It's this idea that there are negatives to this, and this thing needs to be taken in stride. They're not about banning this. They're not about abolishing technology or trying to step back from technology. Of course, there are places in some countries, especially like Bhutan, where they really do take it to that extreme, and that's fine if they want to do that. I see no issue with that. But the idea that for just about every society, progress at some rate is pretty much inevitable, and there's no way to stop that. So the idea is, instead of trying to stop it, just accept it and account for it. That's the thing. So when a new technology comes out and people go out and grab it, and that's great, you can do that. And there's nothing essentially wrong with that, but there will be problems with this change in society. And the job, you could say the moral authorities in society, the aristocrats, the goal is to manage that and find the downsides and figure out what the harm is and try to mitigate that and manage that to the best of its ability. And at the very least, just point it out and acknowledge it. But I've gone through the list of these 10 things. I honestly, again, I'm someone that considers myself a libertarian nowadays. I don't very much side with the more establishment conservatives, which tend to lean way far to the left. But I find that I've agreed with pretty much all of these 10 positions. These are things that I think most Americans disagree with. And this is something to remember, that if Americans are looking at the past and saying, hey, wasn't society really that great in the past? Technology is great and all, but there's something missing now that isn't as good back then, or that isn't as good as it was back then. You got to look at these things. You got to look at this idea of a more American conservative thing. And again, I believe that American conservatism is the best kind of conservatism. It made America the greatest country in the world. It was a kind of mixture. There were some liberal values mixed in with American conservatism. It tends to be much more libertarian. And that's a good thing. I think, it became the greatest country in the world. I think we can see that this style of conservatism is incredibly successful. And you see that a lot of movements, essentially, that the conservatives over time lose. But whenever there's this big upsurge and rise, this new rise of conservatism, what you find is that these real pushbacks against corruption in society and against the far left tend to be more like closer to their old roots. So the old right, for example, you had Murray Rothbard and Alfred J. Nock. I believe Alfred J. Nock was a libertarian. Murray Rothbard was the founder of anarcho-capitalism. He was considered a conservative in the old right back then. And there were loads of conservatives back then that really respected and preferred Murray Rothbard. And then we go to the new right, the next surge. The new right was the Russell Kirk kind of conservatism. I think Frank Meyer was one of those as well. That might have been the old right. I believe Frank Meyer was part of the first new right, but them as well, those kind of people. And then you had as well as that, the second new right was to an extent kind of like the more Reaganism, the idea of Ronald Reagan, and I think Margaret Thatcher was considered there as well, though she's not American, so that was a bit different, but there is kind of a similar rise there. And then you see the third new right of today, which is much more libertarian, because they include classical liberals. If you look at the list of who's the new right today, they include classical liberals like Dave Rubin, and this is essentially the new right is essentially the Donald Trump style of the right. It is much more conservative and libertarian in regards to what America originally stood for. And I think that's a good thing. But we need to make sure we don't slip into this more leftist variety, this more Eisenhower republicanism, this more progressive conservatism, if I've ever heard an oxymoron. But yeah, I think these are good values I wanted to produce these values. I know this video went on for quite a bit, but these are important. And I wanted to make sure people understand them. And hopefully I didn't go on for too long. But let me know what you think in the comments section. Like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. Let me know what you think in the comments section. If you're a conservative, did you agree with these values? Do you differ on some of these? Are you very extreme ones? Do you prefer some more than others? Or if you're a libertarian or you're on the left, do you agree with these values? Which ones do you reject? Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for watching.